Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to be with us. We're so happy that you're here. We have a great presentation prepared for you today. The focus of our content today is on the power of self understanding. This webinar is in partnership with the Learner First. Today is International Stress Awareness Day, and we want to bring more awareness to stress in the world. I'm going to allow folks about 30 seconds to a minute more to join us, make sure the audio is turned on and that we're ready to go. We're really happy to have you here today. Welcome to our webinar. We're going to be talking about the power of self-understanding. This session will be recorded for later viewing. And if you have questions while the speakers are presenting, please feel welcome to send those through the chat function. We will be answering questions at the end of the session today. Excuse me. So please feel free to chat your questions at any point in time. We will have a chance to answer them a little later on. But thank you once again for joining us. The session today is on the power of self-understanding, the importance of that. We're doing this in partnership with the Learner First, and we are delighted to welcome Joanne McEachin from the Learner First. She's the founder there. She's a globally recognized pioneer in the field of educational design, assessment, and well-being. And the Learner First is really focused on the systemic approach of integrating academics and social and emotional learning in schools, really taking a look at the whole student. So it's wonderful to have her with us today to be talking about this. We are also joined by Kelly Kiger, who is a wonderful member of the Gaggle team. She's the therapist manager. She has diverse experience working as a school psychologist, a behavior analyst, and she's worked in a variety of settings. So her insights today are going to be incredibly valuable to us. But I thank everyone for joining us. Please send your questions through the chat. At this time, I'd like to turn things over to JoJo. She's going to be presenting first. So feel free to take it away, JoJo.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa, ko Joanne McEachin tuku ingoa, ko Ngāi Tahu Te Iwi, ko Aotearoa Te Whanaungatanga. My name is Joanne McEachin. I'm from Ngāi Tahu, which is a Māori tribe in the South Island of Aotearoa, New Zealand, and it's my absolute pleasure to be here with you today. And thank you so much to Gaggle for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to spending a little bit of time with you and a bit of time with Kelly today. It's a really important thing to be talking about is stress. And as an ex-teacher myself, I think it's one of the most important things that we talk about. I'd also like to take a bit of time to introduce Beth Hamilton, who's my executive director, who spends a bit of time here with me also, who's based out of San Diego, and she works across the United States and supports my work and our team's work here in the United States. I think the power of self-understanding and magic in the classroom is just really helps us to really think about how stress really is the most important thing to really get a handle on. I talk about dissonance, internal dissonance that we have as teachers often when we're thinking about stress. And one of the ways to really deal with that is to face it and to really talk about it. So I'm really excited to have an opportunity to talk a little bit about that and to think about what's the best way to address that. And the first way is to think about who are we? So just a little bit about myself. I come from, as I said, New Zealand. I also think about identity as one of the most important things to think about. So today I'll talk a little bit about that. But before we do that, a little bit about me, as I said, and my background. I've written a lot of books around deep learning, around how do we really understand who we are, and thinking about competency and education. I started doing that after being a teacher, a principal, a superintendent, and in New Zealand, Aotearoa, New Zealand, I was in charge of the performance of most of the schools in the country. One of the things that I learned in doing that was that it's all very well to have really great policies, it's all very well to have great practice, but the most important thing is to think about is what matters in the classroom, and that's our relationship with kids. And we often think that when we close the door that teachers they've got to deliver a curriculum, but what really counts is that if we don't know who we are and we're walking into a classroom and we get stuck with that whole concept of thinking that it's most important to do the curriculum, we miss out on that really deep relationship that we can have. So I think about when we're talking about learning, we're talking about this work, it all comes down to who are we? So I'm going to start with a really interesting word. And if you were on the session that I did last time with Gaggle, you might remember this word, which is it sounds like I'm going to be swearing, but I promise you that I'm not. It's a word that is in Māori, which is my native and my first language. It's whakawhanaungatanga. And you'll see that there's a whole lot of little wee joining dots that go between people here. And if we really break down what the whole world is about, it's about how do we connect to each other. And if we think about what's going on in the world today, and we look around what's really, really happening, what we can see is it's all about relationships and the breakdown of relationships. And for us, when we think about stress, it's about how do we have those relationships and how do we have that stopping of that breakdown. So as an Indigenous woman, we know that the most important thing in the world is about how do we relate to each other and how do we have those relationships. Sometimes I think about when we go into classrooms that we think about that we have to get through a curriculum. My challenge to all teachers is to think about when we walk into a classroom, everybody sees who we are. And they're not looking at what we're teaching, they're looking at who we are. And I think we sometimes forget about that. So it's the most important thing is to remember who we are first before we go in, because that's what actually the kids are looking at. So when I talk about whakawhanaungatanga, and the reason I say it sometimes sounds like I'm swearing is because that WH is actually sounded like an F. And then the kids have a great time with that. But really what it does is it creates that sense of well-being and laughing and humor to make sure that we're all connecting together. So I talk about 4 different ways of connecting to each other. And it all comes down to this word called contribution. And for me, it's about we can imagine a future where every single child knows who they are, how they fit into the world, and how they can contribute their unique set of skills to humanity. Sometimes what we've done in the past is we've overprivileged certain types of learning, certain types of ways of being, and certain types of careers. And therefore, kids who don't want to do that, they don't get that sense of achievement, that sense of success that other kids have had the privilege of having, I guess, in the world. So what I talk about is that how do we help every single child and every single teacher feel like they can be really successful? So that comes down to about how do we find out for each kid what makes them tick, what makes them feel really good about themselves? How can they understand who they are? So there's 4 outcomes I talk about. One is self-understanding, know who you are, how do you fit into the world, and how can you contribute your skills? The second one's around connection, which I talked about last time. Third one's around knowledge. What knowledge do you need to be you so you can do what you need to do? And the next one's around competency. What are those competencies you need to be able to really unlock your potential so you can really contribute back to the world? Then I think about once we've got those, we can add, that's how we get that sort of relativity, that engagement, that sort of things that kids really want to engage in. And for us as teachers too. So we make actually our learning exciting. So we take what's academic, what's something that's social and emotional, and you can use whatever words you like. If you don't like the word social and emotional, you can choose other words that you want to. So thinking about self-understanding, because then that actually helps us link to our learning so that we don't feel stressed about what we have to do. It actually makes sense to us, and we have a way of really engaging in it. And that gives us that meaning. So therefore, things don't feel so hard. Things don't feel so separate from us. Things feel much more engaging. Things feel much more enjoyable. So we can start to contribute and have meaning and fulfillment. And I've been often heard to be say that meaning and fulfillment is the new wealth, that it actually means that we can actually, that's the new success that we have. And if you talk to our kids today, young kids today, they teach us that. They sort of talk to us about what is it that they want. It's not so much possessions and wealth. They actually want to know that they are contributing and making a difference to our world. So I'm not sure if you agree with me. You can jump in and throw some comments in the chat box if you want to. Love to hear your thoughts on this. So when I talk about self-understanding, let's go dive a little bit deeper into this. Think about understanding who you are as a person. How do you fit into your world, what your goals are, your aspirations, but mostly what's your potential for success? And you think about kids coming into your classrooms and think about you as a learner yourself. What's your potential for success? Do you have that opportunity to be successful? And what gets in your way? And do you have the ability to move those things that get in your way out of the way for you, so that you've got that opportunity to really be able to do that? So for me, it's thinking about how can you really understand yourself? Or another way I think about it sometimes is, how do you remember who you are? As an Indigenous person, I think I've got that ability to do that, to remember myself, because I've been given those gifts from my ancestors. If you're not Indigenous, you might not believe that, but you might have a way of thinking about yourself as to how do you know what you want to do and how do you figure yourself out. So when you think about how stress and self-understanding are closely intertwined, you'll hear words like self-awareness. And when you know who you are, you can understand when that stress level is starting to rise. Emotional regulation, self-compassion, effectiveness, setting boundaries, being able to say no, because you know when you're getting to that stage where you can't do things any further. You'll have a continuum of what you're able to manage and what you're not. You'll have being able to communicate what you're able to do. That's one of the competencies. You'll be able to build that resilience. You get really tired of people saying, go and do another class of yoga. That's not enough. Yes, you need to be healthy and well, but it's about knowing yourself well enough, having your own self-identity to be able to be aware of where you're at on your own learning journey. And that includes all aspects of your life, not just one area. And I think that's setting of realistic expectations, and you need tools to be able to do that. But for me, it's about thinking about the wholeness of a human being, so that we can think about our whole life, not just different aspects of it. And I think in education, we've been really good at separating things. We've been really good at saying that maths is one thing only, reading is one thing, science is one thing, but actually we're whole people. And that's what causes us stress, is when we start to separate things out and try and do things individually, try and assess things individually, try and do things individually. Whereas what I try and do is try and bring them into a whole and do it all at once. So we're not actually trying to overwhelm ourselves with trying to do too many things separately. So if we look at self-understanding, what are the dimensions of that? Let's break it down to another step. And thinking about ourselves as individuals, what are we? So we think about identity. What's our language? What's our culture? What's our interest in? How do we feel? And how do we know who we are? What does that mean? And if we're that, what is somebody else? So we find out, how do we feel about ourselves, and how do we fit into that space, firstly for ourselves and in the world, and then how do we take action to enable ourselves to be successful? The second dimension is around place. Where are we from? What's our land? What's our people? What's the place that we belong? Where do we want to be? How do we feel when we're on that place? Where do we want to go? What's our home like? So those things make a really big difference to us. And you think, as an adult, when we're coming into school, if we've had a great morning with our family, we feel have a great day. If we don't have a great day. Same with our kids. So it's like trying to figure out all of those little bits and pieces. And we have a continuum of success for that. The next one around self-understanding is our purpose. I often laugh, and Bethel she's heard me tell the story so many times. It's, I went to my doctor and she asked me, do I know my purpose for being alive? And I sort of looked at her and I said, well, you're not a naturopath. I didn't expect that to come from my regular doctor. And she said, well, Jojo, the bottom line is if you know your purpose in life, you're going to be a happier person and you're going to be well. And I thought that was a really interesting comment, and sort of a crossover between what I had sort of thought, growing up, that was sort of to know yourself was a little bit woo-woo, but actually it's not. It's the bottom line is, if you know who you are and you know your purpose for life and you know what you're doing and you have some strong goals, you actually have a much better way of managing, and your stress levels are right down, your health levels are much higher, and that is medically proven now. So I think that's something that I had sort of hadn't anticipated hearing from my doctor when I was a younger woman. And then the last one's around capacity. What's your potential for success? And do you have the capacity to build up to that? And then your intuition. Can you use your intuition? You talk about the sixth sense. You talk about things like, do you know when you're ready to do something? Have you got the bravery and the courage and the belief to actually use that to do that? Are you strong enough to make the steps to take action with what you know is the right thing to do? So I think these are the things around self-understanding that enable you to live a good life, enable you to live a stress-free life. Well, stress-free in as far as anybody can live a stress-free life. But I think those are the things that we really want to think about when we're helping our kids to think through our world. So how do we do that? How do we sort of figure out and make these things work out and really sort of get ourselves going? How do we make these things occur? I think it's really sort of an interesting thing. So we start with thinking about what are some of the questions. And I think about each of those dimensions. We have questions to enable our kids to do that. We have a description on our tool set. What does it look like to be successful? And then we start to ask questions, because then that helps us to think and actually create and change. And then we take objectives from our academia. We take objectives from our well-being tools, and we think about how do we combine them to make them real. So we ask questions like, does our physical environment recognize and celebrate our students' languages and identities? Or we say, do we make connections between curricular learning and content and self-understanding? Then we ask questions like, are you and your students learning about yourselves every day? Is it about actually you and yourself rather than just the curriculum? Are you teaching students, not curriculum? Or are you combining them together? And is the learning that we're doing actually making a difference to be able to contribute to lives? So we start to shift what we're learning. We shift the content. We're still teaching content, but we're shifting it to being much more real to the students' lives. And then when we start to assess, we use that holistic assessment where we're thinking about not just standardized testing. We're getting the students to show what they know in their way first. Because when we do that, equity is starting to be realistic when kids show what they know in their way first. I'll say that one more time. Equity is when kids show what they know in their way first, when they can learn in a way that's relevant to them and is culturally appropriate to them. And so what happens is that when we start to do that, you can see stress comes down because it's much more natural and it's about them. It's not about what I want, it's about what they want. So it starts to really give them an opportunity to show you who they are and how they are and what they are and where they are in a way that's much more natural for them. And what we start to see is that when you see the whole learner, we get a really different picture of the student. And the outcomes that we see when we add together learning plus well-being is part of our natural learning. We get engagement because kids love going to school. I have some data in some of the books that I've written that shows that we've got 20% lifts in 1 year in academic achievement. But better than that, we have kids coming to schools on Mondays and Fridays, and we have teachers coming to school on Mondays and Fridays too. In one district, we saved them over $600,000 worth of teacher turnover in 1 year, and that was just across 12 schools. I think what we see is that when kids and teachers start to feel stress-free, well, you can never be stress-free, but when you start to enjoy your work again, academic outcomes, teacher confidence, all of these things really start to lift. But it's because it's about wanting to be back in the learning environment again and wanting to really be who you are because you feel good about who you are and you want to do the learning together. You want to be about you want to be giving and contributing to the world, because contributive learning is really about who you are and contributing to a world that makes it a better place. And I'll just move on to saying this last sort of thing is around that everything that we do is that if we can contribute to life and contribute in a way that is honest and true to ourselves, then we get an opportunity to make a difference to everybody's world and our own world, and then that makes a difference for ourselves. And I'll stop here and I can see there's some comments, and I'll just check what those are. And Beth has been able to write some questions and some ideas and comments for you in that, and then I'll pass across to Kelly in a minute. But I'll just finish off with saying that we have a choice in our daily life about how we choose to engage with our work. And what happens when we use tools to help us understand ourselves, we have a much better chance of enjoying it. And every day that we go, we can make a difference in the lives of our kids by choosing to engage with them as real people versus with the tools or the materials that we're given to teach curriculum with. So we can make a choice about engaging with kids, or we can make a choice to engage with curriculum. And for me, it's about self-knowledge and knowledge of the children that make the biggest difference of all. So we have a choice to engage with each child to contribute in their way and in your way every day, or engage with curriculum. And what I do is I put the engagement with the human first and then engage with the curriculum second. And I tell you what we see is children who understand who they are and teachers who lose that internal dissonance to create that beautiful human being. And we can contribute every day in the way that they want to, and we have a beautiful day. So I hope that your International Stress Awareness Day is a much better day for you, and that tomorrow you can take something from what I've said today and make it a better day for you. So I hope your day is a much better day. So I'll pass it over here back to Maura, and have a wonderful stress-free day.
Thank you.
Ka kite anō.
Thank you so much, Jojo. That was wonderful. I know that many of us can call on memories of times when teachers did extend to us personally, and just the impact that that makes for every student. So I appreciate that. I'm going to turn things over now to Kelly Kiger, and she's going to continue with the presentation. Thanks, Kelly.
Thank you, Maura, and thank you so much, Jojo. This was wonderful. I am so happy to be here, especially on a day dedicated to highlighting the impact of stress in our daily lives and allowing ourselves the opportunity to embrace the opportunity to embrace it and to harness this management of it, and to really move forward in taking control of our stress. A little about me, as Maura had said, I am a former school psychologist and behavior analyst. I've worked in school settings such as residential educational facilities, juvenile detention facilities, preschools, and all the way up through high schools. So I truly am thankful to all the educators who work in all of those capacities, even online schools too. I've had experience there, and there's a whole different host of challenges and successes that you experience. I also have had the opportunity to test a lot of my strategies with the most cynical of skeptics around, teenagers. So everything that I'm suggesting today, I have had the opportunity to work with students on, to see the successes and to build upon them. So today is International Stress Awareness Day, and 77% of Americans polled reported physical symptoms arising from stress. I hear the collective quote from the audience today saying, "I could have told you that, Kelly." And while it's not surprising that we manifest physical symptoms relating to stress, we are all well aware of the interplay between our physical and emotional well-being, as Jojo had shared. What is staggering, though, is the percentage of individuals who are reporting being affected, 77. But stress not only affects adults, children as well are affected. We often see sleep difficulties, seeking to avoid interaction, declining academic performance, and somatic complaints. Somatic complaints are complaints of physical ailments like headaches or stomach aches. And as Jojo had shared, stress management and self-understanding are interconnected. By understanding yourself, you are better able to address and understand your stressors. But how do we do that? And how do we make this emotional internal process explicit and teachable to our students? As educators, it is difficult to find the time to add another task to your day. And as Jojo had shared, it is important to integrate these into your day and into the content that's already out there. Making it more personable and meaningful is important. So if you can't incorporate it into an existing SEL lesson, you can connect through a character analysis of literature or current events. If that's not possible, even consider piloting some classroom implementation with specific students who may require that support immediately. I'm sure you're all thinking of a few who needed this yesterday. It may be helpful to introduce stress management prior to high stress times for students to give them an opportunity to practice skills learned with relative immediacy. Aside from standardized testing time, high stress times for students also include days and weeks leading up to school breaks, especially those who have food insecurities or unstable home lives. As educators, I know you are all thinking about those days leading up to winter break or summer break with excitement, but also there are stressors that are unique to those times of year for you. As the excitement of a new school year wears off, pressures start to mount, not only for students transitioning from a low demand, less intense schedule, but they also have to learn a new classroom or school. They have to learn new rules and routines and understand and interpret a new primary authority figure in their day. That's stressful. So I've created a worksheet that will be made available for you to guide you along with your students to manage their stressors. And this will be stepped out into 4 steps for you. And we'll go through these. But before we do that, and before you work on those steps to identify and manage stress, have a brainstorming session with your students, a whole group session to introduce what coping strategies are for strong emotions. And what I love about a group-wide brainstorm is that you can create a list, a huge, expansive list of so many strategies that students can pull from to use for other strong emotions. So stress, fear, anxiety, anger, hurt, disappointment, and they can pull them at later times as they apply to themselves. So first, as a group, create that list that they can then pull those personalized strategies that they choose. Then our steps for recognizing and managing our stress first start with recognizing the signs of stress. Our students are going to identify the signs that they are even experiencing stress, that evidence or that proof. Then we identify and categorize stressors. This is 2 parts. We're going to work with our students to list out what's weighing on them. Then we categorize them as either stressors that require action or those that require coping strategies. We'll dig into this a little bit more later, but this is huge. This is the biggest step. Step 3 is where we identify what the actual response should be for each stressor. And our last one is our opportunity for our students to take control, to move forward. Now, I'm not sure if you are aware of this fabulous artist, Liz Klimo, but I love her subtle ways of speaking to my heart. And this was perfect for today. It is important to acknowledge and celebrate our feelings, no matter what they are. And on International Stress Awareness Day, let's celebrate, even if we're stressed. So digging into step 1, recognizing the signs of stress. This includes physiological and behavioral changes. Oftentimes, we might recognize these signs in others, but we may not be communicating them. So make sure when you work with your students to create their evidence of stress that you share what you observe too. Self-understanding is also about being receptive to what other people are telling us about ourselves and internalizing that and understanding why that is there, why we have the change in behavior, what that behavior changes. So for example, I see that when you're having strong emotions, you bounce your leg a lot and click your pen off. Have you noticed that? What other things have you noticed? So some of the examples of behavioral changes or physiological changes for stress would include increased agitation, headaches, clenched jaw and stomach aches often because we are clenching our muscles. Restlessness, appetite changes. Interestingly enough, with appetite changes, people may report having a decreased appetite or may report having an increased appetite. Stress actually causes us to crave salty, fatty, sweet foods. So I know personally, if I want a lot of candy or I find myself digging into the candy bowl from Halloween, I might need to check in and connect with myself. Step 2 is the two-part step, identifying and categorizing our stressor. We will first have our students list out all of their stressors they're experiencing without judgment or explanation. The next part of this step is to determine an action plan. And if that's required, or do we need to identify a strategy to cope? How we know this is to ask ourselves, is there anything I could do to change the outcome of the situation? If there is, then an action step is needed. If there's not a way to change the outcome, then a coping strategy would be appropriate. So let's look at this. Let's take some examples from common stressors that I hear from students. An upcoming history test. They can affect the outcome, so that's an action step that's needed. A friend is ill. Unfortunately, there's nothing we can do to affect the direct health of our friend, so a coping strategy would be appropriate here. Tryouts for a school musical? Take action. Waiting to hear about a college acceptance? Sounds as though if we've already gotten to this step, all the action has already been taken, so a coping strategy is needed at this point. Step 3 is identifying the type of response. So when we have an action step required, we might find that these may vary somewhat based on the student's individual personality, needs, skills, even preferred approaches. But it won't vary greatly. So for an upcoming history test, we may work with a student to identify that studying, reviewing quizzes, or taking some practice tests may be the appropriate step. It's also important to reconnect to that self-understanding and having the students identify, is studying independently appropriate, or is it better for me to study in a group? Though many students may want to study in a group, if they're the type that find themselves distracted or distracting others, they may not be the best ones for a study group. So helping to tweak the approach for the action step is an important role that you will have as an educator. Let's look at trying out for the school musical. Some action steps that would be appropriate here may include learning the songs, practicing lines, watching other performances. And your students may identify other strategies that they think are important. Exercising, getting a good night rest, which is awesome. They're coming up with things that they know will work for them. When it comes to coping strategies, they will vary much more from student to student, as they're based more on individual preferences, even emotional control and personality. So if their friend is ill, they may choose to visit the friend or send a card, maybe help with missed schoolwork. I know as adults, we tend to take food to those who are sick. Another option for waiting to hear about college acceptance. Fun distraction. Getting your mind off of it would be appropriate for your student. Reminding themselves, or you reminding them of the hard work they took to get to this point. I actually had a high school student. She was a senior in high school, and she was light years beyond me, and she was very impressive with her self-understanding. It was so neat to see. She had applied for her schools. All of her applications were completed, and she said that her coping strategy, because she was really anxious, was to research for safety school. I thought that was interesting. And I said, why are you doing that? She said, well, I'm not excited about this. I'm not as excited and I'm not looking forward to this school. So I know the disappointment will be huge if I don't get in. Instead of getting stuck in that possible disappointment, I decided that if I research what else is around in the area, events they have at the school, and other things that I might be of interest, like clubs and organizations, then I know my disappointment would be much less. And it takes up time and it allows me to have a distraction that's helpful. It was so wonderful to see such a young person recognizing themselves and making their coping strategy so unique and so helpful. It was so cool knowing that, especially when she got into her school of choice. One more note to remember. And actually, step 4, we didn't discuss. Step 4 is taking action, letting your students go forth and try their coping strategies or their action steps. But not all strategies are universal, so keep this in mind. So I recommend having the brainstorming session and creating a list of strategies. They won't work for everyone or across every situation. If I'm stressed because I have to meal prep and to take my dog to the vet today, reading a book will not help me. But if I'm stressed because I'm coming off of a busy work day and I know I have another busy work day tomorrow, maybe reading my new book will help. What may help for one child also may not help for another. And I know your minds are spinning right now thinking of a student who is going to want the exact opposite of what most of your other students will want or need. This is even more so when we think about those coping strategies because they're personal. Take time to work with the students to determine what they need, what works for them personally. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate your time today. I know how valuable it is. And now I'm going to turn it over to Maura.
Thank you so much, Kelly. It was great to hear some practical ideas and strategies to help students improve self-understanding and also reduce their stress. We have a couple of questions that have come in through the chat. Please feel welcome to bring up your questions if you have them. I'm going to address these to both Jojo and Kelly, and they can kind of see who feels more comfortable taking which one. But the first question that's being asked is, how can we work from upstream to help students instead of trying to tame the daily fires? So what are the thoughts and ideas behind getting out of that emergency moment with students that we are often in and really helping them grow in self-understanding and reduce their stress when it feels like at times we're always scrambling to put out the fires? Do either of you have a thought on that?
Yeah, I'm really happy to answer that one. That's my favorite one to answer because I think that's where my work lies. And I think that's where we, a lot of the time I get called in to work with districts and in whole systems where I talk about them running around with their hair on fire. And I think, so much of the time we spend reacting and we worry about trying to do the right thing and trying to get everything done. And we have part of our methodology of change is that we ask our teachers to choose one student to work with. And we ask them to choose a student to work with who they can't, that they're really struggling to teach, or that they find really hard to teach, or that they just can't teach. And we ask principals to teach one, to work with a teacher who they've really struggled to work with. And we ask district superintendents to work with one school that they've really struggled with. And we ask state leaders to work with one district that they've really struggled with. And we ask countries to work with one area that they've really struggled with, because we all struggle with somebody. And what we're trying to do is break down what I said earlier around those relationships with people. And we all have them at all layers of the system. And what happens is we all blame the other layer. So if we're in a kindergarten, we say we're getting them ready for school because school needs them to do this, but actually they don't. And then school at elementary, they say we're getting them ready for, middle school. Then middle school, we're getting them ready for high school. But actually, we're all just making these myths up. And what I say to stop this running around with our hair on fire is that what we have to do is to go and say, look at that beautiful child in front of you. What does that one child need? What that one child needs, or what that one teacher needs, or what that one school needs is what we do. And we call it just-in-time teaching, just-in-time learning for that one moment in time. Because if we teach that child, then that child gets what they need. And then there's a wholeness that is created within that person. Then that person then has that wholeness that then they can give to that next person, to that next person, to that next person. And we start to fill those holes that we have inside ourselves. And we stop racing around trying to be perfect, because that doesn't happen in the world where there's no such thing as perfection. And I think we've been trying to chase this forever. That's what stops it. It's just slowing down and remembering that we are all human, and that we actually all just want the same thing, which is to be happy, to be normal, and to be loved. And that is the way to do it. And when we just go slowly and we teach to a child and teach to a moment, then we have that opportunity to do that. And we have tools to help us to do that. And I think that's the way to do it, is to slow down. And in the end, by slowing down, we go slow to go fast.
Yeah, no, that's beautiful, because it's a small thing that inspires a trajectory change. So it's that taking a step back to really change the path.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
All right. The next question kind of bridges toward home. And so I think it dovetails quite nicely, but how do we support students who are simply under too much pressure from home? So what thoughts and ideas do you have? Are parent workshops a good idea? Or what are some things that have been successful for either of you?
I mean, I can jump in first, Kelly, and then throw it to you, because I talk. Sorry, I just love to talk about parents too, because they're our untapped workforce. I mean, parents are the people who are in the children's lives for forever, and they didn't used to be part of our job description when we were teachers. Like, I'm old now, but when I was young, when I was a young teacher, say 40 years ago, we did not have to have parents as part of our job description. But now they are part of our job description, and they are our partners in education. They are going to be there with the children till the end of their lifetimes, or hopefully close. So what we want to do is to have them as part of it. If a child is too stressed to learn, they will not learn. So don't try and make them. There's no point. So what you've got to do is look at how do you create the conditions for learning to occur. If your parent is telling you the child is stressed out of their brain, they are. So think realistically about it. They are not going to learn, so don't try and force it. Start to shift the conditions to enable that child to learn. That's all you can do. There is no point. Like teenagers, we know their brain separates when they're at that point in their life. So again, I am the most realistic person in the world. We need to be thinking about humans as humans. How do we make the conditions better for our kids? And if a kid is exhausted and they come to school and they fall asleep in their desk, what do you need to let them do? Sleep. Put them in a space so they can get some sleep you can't make them learn if they're asleep. So let's be human people, and let's let our children be human, and let's help them to be their very best people by giving them what they need.
That's great. And I totally agree. I do think that it's important to understand the themes around the stress. Is the child being stressed because of the home, or because of the parent, or because of other situations? And understanding those themes can help to approach the parent as well. How do we help support that parent with their stressors and alleviate some of their concerns? Or how did we help the parent and the child to work together as a team rather than against each other, which might be causing more stress for not only that student, but the parent as well. It's important to take apart what those stressors are and really determine, do they need those coping strategies or do they need to take action? Where do I fit as an educator and how can I make success? Fixing everything isn't reasonable. And as JoJo had shared earlier, we can't take away all of our stress. But if we can affect change in one area and focus on that stressor, we've then had a positive relationship proven with the students and their parents, or with the family and us. So they're going to be more willing, more likely to lean on us for support, and we can empower them to stand on their own too and help figure out how to solve their other stressors that we aren't able to.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think one thing that both of you have touched on in similar kind of compatible ways is really this idea of, what does each child need? Is it that they need a coping strategy? Is it that they need a nap? Is it that they need a sense of belonging? Or is there some action that we can inspire? And I think that that's really been a beautiful part of this webinar for sure, is kind of hearing those thoughts echoed in different voices. I want to remind everyone that this session will be recorded, that we will be sharing out a variety of different resources following up on the webinar and some tools. If you do have another question, we have a couple more minutes, and we'd be happy to answer that for you in the chat if you want to put it in. But I want to thank both of our presenters for being here today. I think you've done a terrific job of building some inspiration, and also just, I think, giving us a real glimpse of hope. And I think that that's such a powerful thing, particularly, now more than ever. One question I have for both of you is really, how do you, or what's a practical tip or idea for improving self-understanding in the classroom or reducing stress? Like, what would be a great practical suggestion or activity that you might think of?
So I will start with stress. That's one of my favorite areas to talk about because it's something that we can all identify with, even though it might affect us in many different ways. I said earlier, check in and connect with myself when I'm eating that candy. I think the most important thing across a variety of strong emotions is to recognize the signs of change in ourselves. And we might not be able to identify, and our students might not be able to identify the nuance between specific big emotions. But recognizing that there's a change and a big emotion is there, whether it's stress or anxiety or another emotion, that first step is understanding the change, those physiological changes, the behavioral changes, the evidence that we can grasp, that we can say, I know this because. I think that's huge, and it's empowering. And I know it sounds like it can be silly or feel like it's very obvious, but when you try it yourself and you try it with your students, whether they're 8 years old or 18, you get immediate results. And I think that's really cool.
Yeah, and I'll add to that, Kelly. We use a tool called it's a learning progression, and it's a self-understanding learning progression, and it has those, the 4 dimensions that I talked about around self-understanding, and it describes what it looks like across a continuum. And so say for example, for identity, it talks about what it looks like when you're just figuring out who you are, all the way through to when you really know who you are. But what's really beautiful about that that learning progression is we talk about evidence, which is what you're talking about, Kelly. And in that discussion around evidence, it's not a standardized test. It's about what tells you, and what evidence around you helps you understand yourself. So you're having a discussion with the child about, well, how do you know that? And it might be, well, my parents, they give me information about myself, or my peer group, they tell me that I'm a good friend. Well, how do they tell you you're a good friend? What's the evidence that tells you that? Or somebody's called me a name. Does that mean that I'm a bad person? Well, no, you've got all this other evidence around you to tell you that actually, no, you're not. So you start to learn about what are the clues around you that tell you you are who you are. And, you know, what I see when we start to do this work is that we start to teach our children to be really evidence-based about what's around them. That, you know, because I talk about self-understanding as the purest form of assessment, because when we leave school, nobody else tells us whether we're any good or not, except ourselves. And we're always looking for clues around us to give us information to tell us who we are. And you know, the stress comes when we get information that tells us something different about ourselves and what we think. And so we're always seeking, you know, sort of heat-seeking information about who are we and what's going on all around in the world around us. And we're looking for clues to say, are we okay? Are we okay? You know, like, you know, Facebook, tell me, am I beautiful enough? Tell me, am I, you know, all of these sorts of things. But what we're trying to teach kids is that they're okay in their own skin. They're okay as their own person. They're okay as all of that. So what we're doing through the self-understanding work is we're teaching them to evaluate, am I okay? Am I learning all right? Am I good enough? You know, all of these fears that we have as a grown-up that we didn't figure out at school. That's what we're trying to do with the self-understanding work. And to me, that's what we're stopping. You know, we're inoculating them against mental health issues at school by doing this self-understanding work so that they can evaluate themselves as adults, so they're not having to go and get therapy for 100 years when they leave school. So that's what we're trying to do, but we're doing it at the same time as they're learning. So for me, that's a practical way of stopping this issue around managing yourself when you leave school. You know who you are.
Yeah, that's really beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you both so much for being with us today. We are so happy to have had you here to speak with us. It's been quite a pleasure getting to know both of you a little bit more through your work. And I want to remind everyone the recording as well as the resources will be sent out. But thank you so much for being here. Have a wonderful day. Go forth with self-understanding and no stress. Don't go eat Halloween candy now.
Yeah.
Have a wonderful day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you all.